So here's a question for you. What happens when you put the smartest mechanical minds in America in a room and tell them they can't do something? They find a way to do it anyway. And nowhere has this been more true than in NASCAR, where for decades crew chiefs and engineers have played an endless game of cat and mouse with the rulebook. Some of their innovations were so brilliant, so game-changing, that NASCAR had no choice but to completely rewrite the rules just to stop them. Today we're counting down 10 NASCAR tricks that were so genius, they literally forced the sport to change its laws. And trust me, some of these are going to blow your mind. If you enjoy stories about outsmarting the system, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Number 10. Smokey Yunick's long fuel line. In 1966, Smokey Yunick showed up at Daytona with a Chevelle that seemed to run forever on a single tank of gas. Other teams were scratching their heads. How was this car going so much farther between pit stops? The answer was hidden in plain sight. Yunick had installed an 11-foot fuel line instead of the standard one. But here's the genius part. This wasn't just any fuel line. It was oversized, carefully coiled through the car, and held an extra 5 gallons of fuel. 5 gallons. That's enough for 25 more miles at racing speeds. NASCAR inspectors were baffled. They checked the fuel cell, legal size. They looked for hidden tanks. Nothing. The car passed every single inspection because technically, there was no rule about fuel line size or length. Yunick had found a loophole so obvious that nobody had thought to close it. When officials finally discovered the trick during a particularly thorough teardown, they were both furious and impressed. The story goes that when they drained the fuel tank for inspection and told Yunick his car couldn't run without gas, he jumped in, fired it up using the fuel still in that massive line, and drove it back to his garage. NASCAR immediately banned oversized fuel lines and mandated specific fuel line dimensions, but the damage was done. Yunick had already used this trick in multiple races, gaining a massive strategic advantage that helped him stay out on track while competitors had to pit. Teams started measuring everything in their competitors' cars, looking for the next loophole. This single innovation changed how NASCAR wrote rules forever. Instead of saying what you couldn't do, they now had to specify exactly what you could do. Every measurement, every dimension, every component had to be defined. The really incredible part, Yunick later admitted this was just one of dozens of tricks on that car. He claimed it had so many illegal modifications that if NASCAR had found them all, they would have banned him for life. But they only found the fuel line, and that was enough to rewrite an entire section of the rulebook. To this day, fuel system regulations in NASCAR are some of the most detailed and specific rules in all of motorsports, and it's all because one clever mechanic decided to turn a fuel line into a fuel tank. Number 9. Banjo Matthews' offset chassis. Banjo Matthews was watching his car struggle through turns at Bristol Motor Speedway in 1971 when he had a revelation. NASCAR only turns left. So why were the cars built symmetrically? It made no sense. If you're always turning in one direction, shouldn't the car be optimized for that direction? Matthews went back to his shop and built something that had never been seen in NASCAR before. A car with an offset chassis. The genius was in its subtlety. From the outside, the car looked completely normal, but underneath, Matthews had shifted the entire frame slightly to the left, just a few inches, barely noticeable to the naked eye. This put more weight on the left side tires during the left turns, giving them better grip exactly when they needed it most. The driver sat slightly off-center. The engine was mounted at an angle. Every component was positioned to maximize left turn performance. When Matthews' cars hit the short tracks, they were unstoppable. They could carry more speed through corners than anyone else. They could brake later. They could accelerate earlier. Other teams watched in confusion as these seemingly normal cars dominated race after race. Some crew chiefs suspected something was different but couldn't figure out what. The cars passed inspection because there was no rule saying the chassis had to be centered. NASCAR had never imagined anyone would build an asymmetrical race car. It took months before a sharp-eyed inspector finally noticed the offset during a post-race teardown. He was measuring the car for another violation when he realized the frame rails weren't equidistant from the body panels. Once they knew what to look for, officials found several teams had copied the design. The advantage was so significant that NASCAR immediately banned asymmetrical chassis and introduced new measuring procedures using centerline references. They created templates and jigs specifically to catch offset frames. But Matthews had already proven a crucial point. In racing, every single millimeter matters. His offset chassis trick forced NASCAR to completely rethink how they inspected cars. They could no longer just check if parts were legal, they had to check if parts were in the right place. Today's laser inspection systems that measure cars down to thousandths of an inch, they exist because Banjo Matthews decided to move everything a few inches to the left. The rulebook grew by 20 pages just to address chassis symmetry, and Matthews just smiled and started working on his next innovation. Number 8. Junior Johnson's Aero Chevelle. Junior Johnson looked at his 1965 Chevelle and saw what everyone else missed. The problem wasn't the engine, it wasn't the suspension, it was the air. While other teams were obsessing over horsepower, Johnson was in a wind tunnel, studying how air moved over the car's body. And what he discovered would revolutionize NASCAR forever. Johnson realized that by slightly changing the angle of the windshield and roofline, he could dramatically reduce drag without anyone noticing. We're talking about changes so subtle they were invisible to the naked eye. He tilted the windshield back just 3 degrees. He lowered the roofline by barely an inch. He reshaped the rear window to create a smoother airflow transition. From the grandstands, from the inspection bay, even from up close, the car looked completely stock. But at 200 miles per hour, those tiny changes made a massive difference. Johnson's Chevelle was suddenly 5 miles per hour faster on the straightaways than identical cars with more powerful engines. It could run wide open in places where other drivers had to lift. In the draft, it was untouchable. Other teams were baffled. They dyno tested their engines against Johnson's and found they made more power. So how was he faster? The secret stayed hidden for most of the season. Johnson dominated super speedway races while competitors frantically searched for his advantage. They checked his engine, legal. They checked his tires, standard. They even accused him of using rocket fuel. Then, during a detailed post-season inspection, an official noticed the windshield angle looked slightly off. They brought out protractors and measuring tools that had never been used in NASCAR inspection before. That's when they found it. Every piece of glass, every body panel angle had been carefully modified for aerodynamic advantage. NASCAR's response was swift and comprehensive. They created the first ever body templates, metal guides that showed exactly how every curve and angle should look. They mandated specific windshield angles. They defined roof heights down to the 1/4 inch. They even started checking the shape of side mirrors. Johnson's Aero modifications led to the creation of NASCAR's entire modern inspection process. Today, cars go through optical scanning systems that can detect variations of less than a millimeter. All because Junior Johnson figured out that in racing, it's not about how much power you have, it's about how you move through the air. His 1965 Chevelle didn't just win races, it changed how every NASCAR team thought about speed forever. Number 7. Smokey Yunick's 7/8 scale car. In 1967, Smokey Yunick rolled into Daytona with a Chevelle that looked different. Nobody could quite put their finger on it. Something about the proportions seemed off, but when officials measured it against the rulebook, everything checked out. The car was the legal length, it was the legal width, it was the legal height. So why did it look so strange? Because Smokey Yunick had built a 7/8 scale replica of a Chevelle. This wasn't just making the car smaller. That would have been caught immediately. This was genius level engineering. Yunick had proportionally reduced every single dimension by exactly 12.5%, maintaining the visual ratios that made it look like a Chevelle. But here's where it gets brilliant. NASCAR's rules only specified maximum and minimum dimensions for certain key measurements. As long as you hit those numbers, the rest of the car could be whatever size you wanted. So Yunick built the frame 7/8 scale, but stretched the wheels out to meet the minimum width requirement. He made the roof 7/8 size, but used clever bodywork to meet the height requirement at the specific measuring points. The windshield, the doors, the hood, everything was proportionally smaller, creating less frontal area and less drag. The car was essentially shrunk while still technically meeting every single rule in the book. The advantage was enormous. The smaller body punched a smaller hole through the air. It weighed less. It handled better. During qualifying, Yunick's car was consistently 3 to 4 miles per hour faster than identical Chevelle. Other teams demanded inspections, but the car passed every time. The measurements were legal. It took NASCAR officials weeks to figure out what was happening. They started measuring things they'd never measured before: the distance between the door handles, the size of the windows, the proportions of the grille. When they finally understood Yunick's trick, NASCAR didn't just ban it. They completely rewrote how cars were measured. Instead of just key dimensions, they created comprehensive templates that checked the entire body shape. They mandated that cars match production proportions. They started measuring wheelbase to roof height ratios. The 7/8 scale car led to over 50 new measurement rules. Yunick later joked that NASCAR wrote more rules because of his one car than any other in history. He was probably right. Today, NASCAR uses 3D scanning technology that can detect if a car is even 1% out of proportion. All because one man decided if you can't make the car faster, make the air think it's smaller. Number 6. Ford's 427 Cammer engine. In 1964, Ford engineers locked themselves in a secret facility in Dearborn with one mission: build an engine that would destroy everything else in NASCAR. What they created was so advanced, so powerful, that NASCAR banned it before it ever turned a lap in competition. They called it the 427 SOHC, single overhead cam, the Cammer. While everyone else was using traditional pushrod engines that had barely changed since the 1940s, Ford went full Formula One. The Cammer used overhead cams, chains and gears, spinning camshafts directly above the valves. No pushrods, no rocker arms. Just direct, precise valve control that allowed the engine to rev higher and breathe better than anything NASCAR had ever seen. In dyno testing, it made 650 horsepower. The best pushrod engines were struggling to break 550. The engine was a masterpiece of engineering. The timing chain alone was 6 feet long. The valve train was so advanced it could rev to 7,000 RPM reliably, when other engines would explode at 6,000. Ford spent millions developing it. They built special assembly lines. They trained mechanics on the completely different technology. They even prepared a fleet of Galaxies ready to dominate the 1965 season. Then, NASCAR saw the dyno sheets. Officials took one look at the power numbers and panicked. This wasn't just an improvement. This was a quantum leap that would make every other manufacturer obsolete overnight. Chrysler threatened to quit. General Motors said they'd need 2 years to develop something comparable. Track owners worried the cars would be too fast for their facilities. In an unprecedented move, NASCAR banned the engine before it ever raced. They cited cost concerns and maintaining competitive balance, but everyone knew the truth. The Cammer was too good. Ford was furious. They'd played by the rules and built a legal engine that just happened to be revolutionary. They briefly pulled out of NASCAR in protest. The Cammer became a drag racing legend instead, dominating strips across America. But its real legacy was in the rulebook. NASCAR created the first ever approved engine list. They mandated pushrod-only designs. They set limits on valve angles, cam profiles, and RPM ranges. They essentially froze engine technology at 1960s levels, rules that still exist today. The 427 Cammer never turned a competitive lap in NASCAR, but it changed the sport forever. It proved that sometimes being too innovative is just as illegal as cheating. Number 5, the acid-dipped body trick. In the late 1960s, NASCAR teams discovered something that would horrify safety inspectors today. If you dipped sheet metal in acid, you could remove material from the inside, making panels thinner and lighter while keeping the outside looking completely normal. A hood that was supposed to weigh 40 pounds could be reduced to 20. A roof could lose 15 pounds. Do this to every body panel and you could make a car 200 pounds lighter without anyone knowing. The process was insane. Teams would literally submerge body panels in acid baths, carefully timing the exposure to eat away just enough metal. Too long and the panel would become tissue paper thin and collapse. Too short and you didn't save enough weight. The sweet spot was panels that were about half their original thickness but still strong enough to survive a race. From the outside, they looked perfect. The paint covered any signs of the treatment. Even tapping on them sounded normal because the outer surface was intact. The advantage was huge. In racing, weight is everything. A lighter car accelerates faster, brakes better, and uses less tire. 2. 100 pounds might not sound like much, but at race speeds, it's worth half a second per lap. That's the difference between winning and finishing 10th. Teams using acid-dipped bodies were suddenly competitive with much smaller engines. They could run less rear gear and still accelerate quickly. They could use harder compound tires and still have grip. The trick stayed secret for nearly 2 years. Teams guard their advantages jealously, and nobody wanted to reveal how they were suddenly so fast. But during a 1969 post-race inspection at Talladega, an official accidentally put his thumb through a door panel. The metal was so thin it just crumpled. Further investigation revealed the entire car was basically made of metal foil painted to look solid. NASCAR went ballistic. They immediately mandated minimum thickness requirements for all body panels. They started using ultrasonic testing equipment to measure metal thickness without removing paint. But teams had already pushed the boundaries of material science in ways nobody expected. Some had experimented with different acids for different metals. Others had tried selective dipping, making panels thinner in low-stress areas while keeping them thick where strength was needed. The acid-dipping era forced NASCAR to become materials experts. They had to learn about alloy compositions, chemical treatments, and metal fatigue. Today, all body panels come from approved suppliers and are tracked from manufacture to installation. Random thickness testing is standard at every race, all because someone figured out that if you can't use lighter materials, just use less of the materials you have. Number 4. The tire soaking era. In 1989, a crew chief whose name has been lost to history made a discovery that would turn NASCAR upside down. If you soaked racing tires in certain chemicals, the rubber would become softer and grippier without looking any different. It was like having rain tires in dry conditions. Massive grip advantage with no visual evidence. The first team to figure this out dominated so thoroughly that within 6 months, everyone was doing it. The chemicals were exotic, toluene, xylene, benzene-based compounds that would make an OSHA inspector faint. Teams would seal tires in special containers and soak them for days before a race. Some used injection methods, shooting chemicals directly into the rubber through tiny holes that were then sealed. Others developed spray-on treatments that would penetrate the tire surface. The most advanced teams had different chemical cocktails for different tracks, one mix for short tracks, another for super speedways. The performance gain was staggering. Soaked tires could be a full second per lap faster. Cars that should have been sliding through corners were stuck like glue. Lap times that seemed physically impossible were suddenly routine. But there was a dark side. These chemicals were toxic. Crew members were getting sick. Some developed respiratory problems. Others had skin reactions from handling treated tires. The garage area smelled like a chemical plant. NASCAR knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. Tires looked normal. They felt normal. Traditional hardness testing showed nothing unusual. It wasn't until a chemist suggested gas chromatography testing that they found evidence. The molecular structure of the rubber had been altered. NASCAR's response was comprehensive and expensive. They mandated that all teams use spec tires delivered directly to the track. They implemented random tire sampling, taking rubber samples to mobile labs for immediate testing. They introduced durometer testing that could detect even slight changes in rubber hardness. They created a chain of custody for tires from Goodyear's factory to the moment they were mounted. The tire soaking era only lasted about 18 months, but it changed NASCAR forever. Today, tire regulations take up an entire section of the rulebook. Every tire is coded, tracked, and tested. Teams can't even take tires back to their shops. The grip those soaked tires provided was incredible, but the cost, in health, in fairness, and in money to police it, was too high. NASCAR learned that when racers will risk their health for a competitive advantage, the rules need to protect them from themselves. Number 3. Chevrolet's Monte Carlo drop mirror body trick. In 1983, Chevrolet teams started showing up with Monte Carlos that sat differently. Something was off about the stance. The cars looked lower, meaner, more aerodynamic, but when NASCAR measured ride height, they were legal. When they checked the frame, it was the right height. Every measurement checked out. So why did these cars look like they were squatting? because teams had figured out how to mount the body lower on the frame without technically breaking any rules. The trick was brilliant in its simplicity. NASCAR measured ride height from the ground to the frame rails. They measured body height from specific points on the body to the ground, but they didn't measure the relationship between the body and the frame. So teams started mounting bodies lower on the chassis, sometimes by as much as 3 inches. The frame was at legal height. The body met its height requirements at the measuring points, but the entire body sat lower relative to the frame, reducing the frontal area and improving aerodynamics. The engineering required was impressive. Teams had to relocate body mounting points, they had to modify floor pans, they had to reroute exhaust systems and drive shafts. Some even changed suspension geometry to maintain proper handling with the altered center of gravity, but the payoff was worth it. The lower body position reduced drag by almost 10%. At Daytona and Talladega, these cars were 5 to 7 miles per hour faster than conventional Monte Carlos. NASCAR inspectors were stumped for months. They knew something was different but couldn't find an illegal modification. The cars passed every measurement in the rulebook. It took a former crew chief turned NASCAR official to spot the trick. He noticed that the door sills were closer to the frame rails than they should be. Once they knew what to look for, they found dozens of cars using the same modification. The response was swift and comprehensive. NASCAR created body-to-frame relationship rules. They introduced template stations that checked not just height, but position. They mandated specific mounting points that couldn't be modified. They even started using jigs that attached to the frame and measured to the body, ensuring proper relationships. The drop body trick led to the creation of NASCAR's modern body template system. Today, cars go through dozens of templates that check every curve, angle, and relationship. The templates are so precise they can detect if a body is mounted even a quarter inch out of position. All because Chevrolet teams figured out that if you can't make the car lower, you can make the body lower on the car. The Monte Carlo drop body era only lasted 1 season, but it revolutionized how NASCAR inspects race cars forever. Number 2, the trick restrictor plate scandal. In 1991, after a series of spectacular crashes at Daytona and Talladega, NASCAR mandated restrictor plates, metal plates that limit airflow into the engine, reducing horsepower and speeds. Everyone hated them. Drivers said it was like racing with one hand tied behind their back. But some clever crew chiefs saw opportunity where others saw oppression. If you had to use a restrictor plate, why not make it a special one? The cheats were works of art. Some teams drilled microscopic holes through the plates, so small they were invisible to the naked eye but collectively flowed significant extra air. Others made plates from special alloys that would expand when heated, opening up the restrictor holes once the engine was warm. The most sophisticated used a technique called deflection engineering, plates that looked solid but would flex under the pressure of incoming air, creating gaps that didn't exist during inspection. One team developed a restrictor plate with a memory metal insert. Below 100 degrees, it maintained the legal restriction, but once the engine heated up, the metal would change shape, opening additional passages. Another team created plates with hidden chambers that would trap air during low-speed inspection, but release it at racing speeds. Some even experimented with coating that would burn away during a race, enlarging the holes after inspection. The advantages were massive. In restrictor plate racing, even 5 extra horsepower is huge. These trick plates could provide 20, 30, even 40 additional horsepower. Cars that should have been stuck in the pack were suddenly pulling away on straightaways. The problem was proving it. After a 3-hour race, the plates were hot, distorted, and covered in carbon deposits. Even if NASCAR suspected tampering, the evidence was often destroyed by the race itself. Everything changed at the 1991 Pepsi 400 when NASCAR decided to impound the top 5 restrictor plates immediately after the race before teams could swap them out. What they found shocked even veteran inspectors. Every single plate had been modified in some way. NASCAR's response was nuclear. They started manufacturing and distributing the restrictor plates themselves, handed out just before qualifying. They introduced tamper-proof seals. They implemented post-race testing that could detect even molecular-level modifications. They brought in metallurgy experts and material scientists. Today, restrictor plates are more controlled than currency. They're serial numbered, tracked, and inspected with equipment that can detect modifications down to 10,000ths of an inch. The trick restrictor plate scandal didn't just change rules. It changed NASCAR's entire enforcement philosophy. They learned that racers would modify anything, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, if it meant going faster. The era of trusting teams to follow the spirit of the rules was over. Now, if NASCAR doesn't specifically control it, someone will find a way to cheat it. Number 1, Chrysler's Winged Warriors, 1969. NASCAR was about to witness the most audacious, brilliant, and ultimately devastating innovation in its history. Chrysler walked into Daytona with the Dodge Charger. Daytona, a car wearing a 2-foot nose cone and a wing that stood nearly 2 feet above the roof. It looked like something from a science fiction movie. Other teams laughed. Then, it qualified at 199.4 miles per hour. Nobody was laughing anymore. The aerodynamics were revolutionary. That ridiculous-looking nose cone reduced drag by 20%. The massive wing created downforce that glued the car to the track at speeds where others were getting loose. Wind tunnel testing showed it was more aerodynamically efficient than some aircraft. Chrysler had taken NASCAR's stock car concept and thrown it out the window. This wasn't a modified street car. This was a purpose-built racing machine that happened to look vaguely like a street car. A year later, Plymouth joined the party with the Superbird, an even more refined version of the concept. These winged warriors dominated superspeedway racing like nothing before or since. They were 10 to 15 miles per hour faster than conventional cars. At Talladega, Buddy Baker drove a Daytona to 200.4 miles per hour, the first car to break 200 in NASCAR. The racing wasn't even close. Winged cars would finish minutes ahead of traditional bodies. Other manufacturers were in full panic mode. Ford and Chevrolet demanded NASCAR do something or they'd quit. Track owners worried about safety. These speeds were beyond what their facilities were designed for. Insurance companies threatened to cancel coverage. The domination was so complete that fans were losing interest. Why watch when you knew a winged car would win? NASCAR faced a crisis. Let the innovation stand and potentially lose manufacturers and fans, or stop it and admit that innovation had gone too far. In 1971, NASCAR made the most controversial decision in its history. They effectively banned the winged cars through a combination of rules. They limited engines in aerodynamic cars to 305 cubic inches, while allowing conventional bodies to run 430. They restricted body modifications. They capped spoiler heights. They created templates that made the wings impossible. The cars that had defined the future of racing were legislated into extinction. It wasn't just a rule change, it was NASCAR declaring that there were limits to innovation. The Winged Warriors raced for less than 2 seasons, but their impact was eternal. They proved that aerodynamics mattered more than horsepower. They showed that stock cars didn't have to look stock. They forced NASCAR to confront what it wanted to be, a pure racing series or a marketing platform for street cars. The decision to ban them set NASCAR's philosophy for the next 50 years. Innovation was acceptable, but only within strict boundaries. The sport would never again allow such a dramatic technological leap. Today's Cup cars, with their carefully controlled aerodynamics and spec parts, are the direct result of NASCAR's fear of another Winged Warrior era. Chrysler's Daytona and Superbird didn't just dominate racing, they were so good, so far ahead of their time, that they changed what NASCAR would allow forever. They remain the only cars in NASCAR history that were banned not for cheating, but for being too innovative. And there you have it. That's 10 NASCAR innovations so genius they literally rewrote the rulebook. From hidden fuel tanks to acid-dipped bodies to wings that touch the clouds, these creative minds pushed the boundaries of what was possible and forced NASCAR to constantly evolve its rules. Which one of these tricks impressed you the most? And what other racing innovations do you think deserve to make this list? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into racing's most creative rule bending, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about motorsports innovation and the endless battle between racers and regulators. Until next time, keep pushing the limits. Just maybe not quite as far as Smokey Yunick did.